And we are back for the Season 7 Watch full season review, and so let's get back into it. So let's talk about Jon and Davos, or judge me by my heritage, except, the bad parts. For those, you can judge me as an individual. So the Jon story begins with the new king making somewhat controversial decisions up in the north. He announces that all women will be trained to fight, and that the wildlings will man Eastwatch by the sea. He has a disagreement with Sansa over what will happen to Karstark and Umber lands. Jon believes that the children of Umber and Karstark are not guilty of their parents' crimes, and therefore should inherit their castles, and so Ned Umber and Alice Karstark pledge fealty to him. Jon has some spats with Sansa, as he is upset about being called out in front of everyone, and feels that everyone should be paying attention to the Night King and not Cersei, though the two still seem to respect each other. After a letter arrives from Tyrion, Jon considers going to treat with Dany, and Davos reminds him that dragons would be useful against whites, though they all agree that the trip would be too risky. That is, until a letter from Sam arrives about dragonglass being on Dragonstone. Jon, much to the protest of the other lords, decides he must go himself to Dragonstone to treat with Dany. Bronzion Royce notes that no Lannister or Targaryen can be trusted based on their past actions. Jon, though, still goes and leaves Sansa in charge of Winterfell. Before going, Jon visits Ned's statue down in the crypts and has a brief exchange with Littlefinger, resulting in Jon choking him down a bit. Jon later arrives on Dragonstone and catches up with Tyrion a bit before finally meeting Dany. The two soon find conflict as Ned helped overthrow Dany's father, while her father murdered Jon's uncle and grandfather, though the two seem to agree that children are not guilty of their parents' crimes. Still, the conversation does not go well as Dany wants Jon to bend the knee, which he refuses, while Jon wants Dany to come help fight the army of the dead, which she refuses. Jon is ordered to stay on Dragonstone, and so he goes off to brood about being an effective prisoner. Tyrion joins Jon, upset about Euron's recent attack, and asks Jon if there's anything else Jon needs. Jon wants the dragonglass on the island, which Dany agrees to let Jon mine. Later, while Dany is busy having girl talk with Missandei, Jon finds Dany to show her the dragonglass before the mining begins. They go into the caves and Jon shows Dany ancient cave drawings made by the Children of the Forest, showing that the children and humans united together to fight the White Walkers. Outside, Dany finds out about her defeat at Highgarden and Casterly Rock and is furious at Tyrion for advising her against attacking King's Landing. She then asks Jon for advice, and Jon essentially agrees with Tyrion. Dany then leaves to go off to war. Later, Davos teases Jon about having a crush on Dany, and Jon asks Missandei about her relationship with Dany. Missandei says that she, the Unsullied, and the Dothraki chose Dany as their leader. Theon arrives and Jon tells Theon that if it weren't for his actions to help Sansa, he would kill him. Dany returns to Dragonstone and Jon mysteriously gets along with Dany's dragons before Jon meets Jorah. A letter from Bran arrives saying that the army of the dead is near Eastwatch. Tyrion suggests that people capture a white and bring it back to show Cersei, and Jon chooses to lead the party that captures the white. Davos then smuggles Tyrion into King's Landing so he can present Jaime with a proposition for an armistice. Davos then goes and collects Gendry, and they run into a slight snag with some guards, but they still escape. Gendry and Jon then meet, and the two bond over the relationship their fathers had. Dany says goodbye to Jon, and the crew then heads up to Eastwatch. They speak with Tormund a bit before finding out that the Brotherhood Without Banners is there. The crew then heads out north of the wall to find a white. A number of exchanges occur on their quest, including Tormund complaining about Mance's pride and his inability to bend the knee, as well as Jorah refusing Longclaw, saying that Jon should pass it to his children instead. Beric and Jon talk about Ned as well, and how Jon doesn't look like him, and the two decide that fighting against death is perhaps the best goal in life. The crew runs into an undead polar bear and follows his tracks back to a White Walker and some whites. They successfully capture a white, but also end up attracting the main army, and so they send off Gendry to get help, and the crew ends up trapped on an island. After a night, Thoros dies and is burned, and the Night King arrives. A battle commences, and then Dany rescues everyone just in the nick of time with her dragons. However, the Night King takes the opportunity to kill a dragon. Dany and everyone escapes as Jon falls into water. Jon climbs out to do some more fighting, and then Benjen arrives with a horse and sends Jon on his way. Jon makes it back to the wall, and Dany sees his scars from his death at the end of Season 5, and she later talks to Jon, and Jon bends the knee to Dany while the two connect a bit. North of the wall, though, the Night King resurrects Viserion. Jon and Davos then head to King's Landing for the great meeting with Cersei. Jon tells everyone about the army of the dead and shows off their captured white. Cersei says she will join the fight if Jon vows to stay out of the Dany-Cersei war. Cersei claims she can trust the son of Ned Stark. Jon reluctantly admits that he's already bent the knee to Dany. Cersei then storms off. Jon and Dany then discuss Dany's fertility a bit before Cersei returns and agrees to join them. Jon and Dany then decide they should take a boat together north, and Jon tells Theon that he's both a Stark and a Greyjoy. Jon and Dany then meet on their boat and proceed to have sex. So, what is there to say about the Jon and Davos story? The Jon story seems to be greatly focused on the concept of inheritance. What do we inherit from our ancestors? What is our birthright? What are we owed? But also, what are we responsible for? What do we have to make up for? When are we judged for where we came from, and at what point are we judged for who we are individually? Where does our own personal merit come in? Of course, our story begins with Jon saying that Ned Umber and Alys Karstark are not responsible for the crimes of their ancestors, and yet Jon is allowing them to inherit their castles from their ancestors. And this is an important question. If we can reap benefits from our ancestors' actions, why should we not have to pay for our ancestors' actions as well? Sansa's suggestion that the lands should go to people who actually fought in war would be more meritocratic, but this action is dismissed as destroying the legacy of great houses. The idea of inheritance comes up again when Bronzion Royce says that no Targaryens can be trusted. Dany is inheriting the legacy of her father. Jon and Dany talk about this as well, yet they dismiss the idea that children are guilty of their parents' crimes. Yet at the same time they speak about how great it was when the Starks and Targaryens of the past were allies. It's all a contradiction, as Dany wants to be absolved of her father's crimes, but still wants to inherit her father's seat. Essentially, she wants to inherit some things, but not others. Now keep in mind, Dany's claim over Westeros is to be contrasted with Jon's kingship, as he was chosen to be king based on his actions. He had no right to inherit being a bastard, but he was made king anyway. He has a kingship of merit, not inheritance. But actually later on, Dany's queenship is described this way as well. As Missandei tells us, the Unsullied and Dothraki didn't care about Dany's birthright or inheritance. They chose to follow her, so her queenship is to them meritocratic. And this actually all gets into Jon's decision to finally kneel to Dany. When faced with Dany's birthright or the history of Starks kneeling to Targaryens, Jon rejects Dany's claim. It's only when Dany risks her life and her dragons to save Jon that she becomes his queen. She is a queen of merit to Jon, not a queen by birthright. And we have a spattering of other hints that merit should ideally trump birthright. For example, Ned is declared as more of a father to Theon than Balon. That's merit over ancestry. And Jorah declares that he lost his right to Longclaw, in this case a perceived lack of merit over ancestry. Now all of this gets into some very interesting questions about human responsibility. Are we innocent and unattached to the past, or do we inherit things? If we inherit, do we inherit both the good and the bad? For example, today in America, people often debate whether we today are responsible for the crimes of our ancestors with regards to abuses against, say, the American Indians or slavery. Can we really honor and benefit from a system our ancestors built without also being responsible for the negative externalities that those systems created? Can Dany really claim her queenship by birthright without also being connected to the Mad King, the source of her birthright? And what responsibilities does Dany have for her father's actions? Or perhaps we should all just be considered individuals. Perhaps it's a better system if we break the wheel and inherit nothing and everyone achieves things only based on personal merit. Now these are all interesting questions, and I do credit the show for bringing these issues up, but I'm also not quite sure the writers really know where they're going with this message. If personal merit is better than birthright, why is Gendry so obsessed with his connection to his father, a father he never knew? If personal merit is better than birthright, why is it important that the dragons like Jon based on what seems to be his blood? If personal merit is better than birthright, why does Beric bring up that Jon is taking after his mother? If personal merit is better than birthright, why is it important that everyone's ancestors fought the White Walkers? All of these scenes seem to present ancestry, which is unearned, in a positive light. But most importantly, if personal merit is better than birthright, why is it important that Jon is the supposed true king of Westeros by birthright? Why does Jon need to know this information? Is this inherited kingship really to be valued more than the kingship and queenship that Jon and Dany earned? If it is, it seems to go against the idea of the Lords of the North and Vale choosing Jon, or the idea that Missandei, the Unsullied, and the Dothraki chose Dany, or the fact that Jon himself chose Dany. I certainly hope the show clarifies its message in Season 8, because as it stands, the message is garbled. Are Jon and Dany valued because of their blood, or are they valued because of their character? I guess now we can briefly talk about Davos. Sadly, he was not given much time this season. His character really shined in past seasons when he was the conscience of Stannis. He also made for a good speechmaker when others couldn't find their voice. Jon apparently had no need for these services this season, so Davos's role was to remind everyone that dragons breathe fire, to tease Jon about his attraction to Dany, and to retrieve Gendry. I suppose he also smuggled Tyrion into King's Landing. On top of being rather impotent, Davos is also astoundingly out of character this season, somehow being super chipper all of the time. This is after everyone he has known and loved dying. He weirdly even recalls the death of his son in a cheerful voice to Tyrion at King's Landing. I do hope there is something for Davos to do next season, because right now he's just kind of hanging out. And next let's talk about the Bran story, or Machina ex Machina. So our Bran story opens with him seeing the army of the dead walking. We find that Bran has arrived at the Wall, where his personality is markedly different from last season. He is now seemingly without much emotion or compassion. Bran lets Dolorous Edd know that he saw him at the Fist of the First Men and at Hardhome, and so Bran and Meera are allowed through the Wall. Bran next makes it to Winterfell, where he tells Sansa that he saw her the night she was raped, upsetting Sansa quite a bit, and this is followed up with Littlefinger giving a gift dagger to Bran. Bran reveals that he has seen Littlefinger in the past, recalling the line, "Chaos is a ladder." Meera then says goodbye to Bran, and Bran has no reaction. She mentions that her brother Hodor and Summer died for Bran, but Bran doesn't seem to care. Meera comments that the Bran she knew is dead. Bran then meets with Arya and Sansa and reveals that Littlefinger gave him a dagger and passes that dagger to Arya. He then spots the Night King's army near Eastwatch and sends a message to Jon about it. At some point, Bran finds out that Littlefinger betrayed Ned back in Season 1 and that he is pinning Arya and Sansa against each other. Just in the nick of time, he lets Sansa know this, and so they have a trial for Littlefinger where Bran presents this information. Littlefinger is executed. Sam makes it to Winterfell and they discuss Jon's true parentage and the fact that a convenient annulment makes Jon the king of Westeros. Our final scene recalls the first scene, with Bran seeing the army of the dead walking again, but this time they have a dragon and they bring down the wall. After bringing down the wall, the army of the dead continues its march south. And so, what is there to say about the Bran story? Well, there isn't much of a story at all this season. He exists for a little exposition and to show the Night King's army a few times, which are both fairly unnecessary to the plot. And he's there to miraculously save Sansa and Arya just in the nick of time with his omniscient power, which was frankly cheap, though we discussed this last time with the Sansa and Arya plot. The closest thing we have to a character arc with Bran this season is his loss of humanity and the departure of Meera. The Meera scene is well done, but it also comes out of nowhere. Bran was fine last season and quite suddenly became robotic at the beginning of this season. But the unfortunate side effect of a character that lacks humanity and emotions means that the character is now completely unrelatable and unsympathetic. And I'm not sure how they can salvage the character or the plot next season. Have his humanity return? Who knows? Which brings us to the Samwell story, or I was disillusioned until I found my way, then I was more disillusioned. So the Samwell story opens with Sam unhappy at the Citadel. He catalogs books, serves meals, and cleans up feces. We have a very memorable shit montage. Sam, though, notes that there is a restricted area with information that may be useful. He tells Archmaester Ebrose about the army of the dead and wants assistance, including access to the restricted area. Despite Ebrose believing Sam, he turns Sam down. So Sam decides to steal keys and go into the restricted area, where he finds a book revealing that Dragonstone has dragonglass. He then writes Jon about his discovery. Sam runs into Jorah at the Citadel. After he and Ebrose examine Jorah, Jorah is told that he's hopeless and must leave. Sam then discovers that Jorah is Jeor Mormont's son and feels obligated to help him. Sam mentions to Ebrose that there is a procedure to treat Jorah, but Ebrose says it's too risky to perform. And so Sam sneaks in to see Jorah and performs the procedure anyway. The procedure is successful, Jorah is declared healthy, and he is discharged. Sam is praised for doing good work, but is also criticized for breaking the rules and putting everyone at risk. As penance, Sam must transcribe a bunch of old books. Later, a letter comes from Winterfell about the army of the dead. Despite Sam corroborating the story, the Maesters pass up helping and want more information first. Sam is livid, and finally snaps after Gilly recites seemingly irrelevant information from one of the books. Sam then and there decides to leave the Citadel, quoting his father's words about not wanting to waste his life reading about the accomplishments of better men. He grabs a few more books, and they head north. Sam makes it to Winterfell and speaks with Bran. Bran reveals that Jon is the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, and then Sam adds that the two were actually married in a secret ceremony, making Jon the true-born heir to the Seven Kingdoms. So what is there to say about the Sam plot? Well, the Sam plot seems to be about Randall Tarley's words of action. Essentially, it's about being a hero instead of reading about being a hero. Sam hears these words last season before heading to the Citadel and repeats them on his exit. Apparently, Randall was correct that the Maesters were navel-gazing do-nothings and that the Sam story was about discovering this fact and taking action. Of course, there are a number of absolutely crippling problems with this theme. First of all, Samwell begins the season disillusioned with the Citadel. The season literally starts with a hellish shit montage. This makes Sam's story static rather than dynamic, and he isn't discovering anything new over the course of the season. He already knew that the Citadel sucked and wouldn't listen to him, and he finishes the season thinking the Citadel sucks and won't listen to him. We have no real reason why Sam chose this particular moment to leave. Was transcribing worse than the shit montage? Additionally, Sam's tenure at the Citadel was actually rather successful. He didn't do nothing or simply read about better men. He found the dragon glass, he cured Jorah's grayscale, and he found out about Rhaegar and Lyanna's marriage. These are some pretty big achievements. In fact, it's more achievement than Sam has had in years. It's rather off that Sam would grow tired of the Citadel when he has been rather successful there. And he actually seemed to have been making some headway with Archmaester Ebrose. I'm uncertain why Sam gave up when he did, and how Sam hopes to be useful to Jon at Winterfell. Another huge problem with the Sam story is that Sam believes his father's words. Randall Tarley was a massively abusive man who threatened to murder his son on a hunt unless he took the black. Randall felt Sam's academic pursuits were unmanly. Sam rejecting the Citadel while quoting his father seems to give credence to Randall Tarley's anti-intellectualism and even his abuse of Sam. That somehow what the world needs is less thinking and study and more manly fighting. Apparently the world needs less of Sam and more of Randall. And of course all of these problems are on top of Sam forgetting Dragonstone had dragonglass, Jorah healing overnight, and secret annulment/marriages being some sort of thing. I would say these are far from minor nitpicks and were massively jarring to the story, so really the Sam story was an illogical mess on nearly every level, making it really the second weakest story after the Sansa and Arya storyline. And sadly, I don't really see much hope for Sam being useful in the future. Jon already has a hand with Davos, not to mention Sansa, Arya, Bran, Dany, and Tyrion to give him advice. Sam wasn't very useful prior to going to the Citadel other than speaking for Jon at his election. I don't see how he's going to be useful in the future. I really think they should have left Sam where he was, though perhaps some interesting conflict will arise from the fact that Dany killed his father and brother. And speaking of Dany, this brings us to our final storyline, the Daenerys and Tyrion story. Or, I Believe in You, as a puppet for me. The Dany and Tyrion story begins with them landing on Dragonstone. Once settled in, Dany begins grilling Varys on his support for Viserys and the attempt on her life first season. Varys gets out of things by claiming that he wants good rulers who care about the people. Melisandre then arrives and tells Dany that she should call up Jon Snow because of prophecy. Tyrion vouches that Jon is a good guy, and so Dany sends off a letter. We then get into Dany's battle plans. Everyone else wants to attack King's Landing, but Tyrion convinces everyone that the best plan of action is a Westerosi-led siege of the city while the Unsullied attack Casterly Rock. Olenna then gives advice to Dany: forget your advisors, be a dragon, and rule yourself. Grey Worm and Missandei then have some sexy time, and then Jon Snow arrives. Dany demands that Jon bend the knee based on past Stark homage, and he refuses. Likewise, Jon asks Dany to help fight the army of the dead, and she refuses. In the end, Dany makes Jon an effective prisoner on the island. News then arrives that the Ironborn fleet was attacked by Euron, and the Greyjoys and the Dornish are dead or captured. Tyrion's plan was a failure. Tyrion goes to Brood and convinces Jon Snow to ask for something else, and so Jon asks for the dragonglass on the island. Tyrion tells Dany that the dragonglass is nothing to her, so she might as well give it away to improve relations. She does, and her relationship with Jon Snow begins to improve. The group then discusses their military plans a bit more. Tyrion reveals that his big military plan is that Grey Worm will attack Casterly Rock, but because of a secret passage that Tyrion built in the sewers, they will have access to the castle for an easy win. Though things don't actually go that way. Dany and Missandei have a little girl talk before Jon takes Dany into the Dragonglass Caves to show her the drawings from the Children of the Forest about teamwork. And she and Jon seem to connect a bit more, I guess. Outside of the cave, Dany learns that Tyrion's plans were once again a failure. Jaime and Euron outplayed Tyrion. Casterly Rock was abandoned, the Targaryen fleet destroyed, and Highgarden taken. Dany is furious and even accuses Tyrion of sabotaging her and protecting his family. Dany then asks Jon for advice, and he supports Tyrion and says that King's Landing should not be attacked. Dany chooses to go into battle, but outside of King's Landing instead. She destroys much of the Lannister army, but does discover that the Lannisters have some anti-dragon ballistas. Drogon is hurt, and while removing the arrow, Jaime nearly kills Dany. Tyrion watches over the scene, not wanting his brother killed, and later lamenting the loss of life. Dany announces that everyone must submit or die, but the Tarlys refuse. Tyrion urges restraint, but Dany burns them alive. Dany returns to Dragonstone and discovers that Jon gets along with her dragons, and Dany is reunited with Jorah. Tyrion and Varys then sit and are aghast at Dany's behavior with the Tarlys. They speak of how they need to control her in order to make her a better ruler. Jon tells everyone that Bran sent a letter about the Night's King army near Eastwatch. Tyrion suggests that someone capture a White and bring it back to show Cersei. Jon agrees to lead that mission, and Dany is concerned. Tyrion is smuggled into King's Landing where he meets with Jaime. They discuss the murder of Tywin a bit before Tyrion proposes an armistice. Dany and Tyrion then have some goodbyes for the White capturing crew, and then Tyrion and Dany sit and have a chat. Tyrion notes that Jon is in love with Dany, and they talk a bit about building a new political system. Tyrion suggests a more democratic system for choosing leaders in case of Dany's death. Dany, though, becomes angry at the topic. A letter arrives from Gendry and Davos about the White capturing crew, and Dany decides she needs to go rescue them. Tyrion pleads for her not to go, saying that everything depends on her, but she goes anyway. Dany rescues everyone, but one of her dragons dies, and Dany mourns the loss. She is also upset about the loss of Jon, but miraculously Jon returns. Dany sees Jon's scars from when he died, and Dany and Jon connect a bit, and Jon eventually bends the knee to Dany. The Night King, though, retrieves Viserion's body and resurrects him. Tyrion heads into King's Landing for the meeting with Cersei, and Dany arrives on her dragon to show power. Tyrion and Jon tell everyone about the Whites and show one off. Cersei agrees to help as long as Jon stays out of the Cersei-Dany war, but Jon reveals he bent the knee, so Cersei storms off. Tyrion realizes that he must go and talk to Cersei, and so Cersei and Tyrion vent at each other, with most of it centering around the murder of Tywin. Tyrion even tells Cersei to go ahead and kill him. While the two continue to talk, Dany and Jon talk about Dany's ability to have children, and Cersei returns and agrees to join the war against the army of the dead. After the meeting, Dany and Jon decide they should take a boat together north, and while sailing, Dany and Jon proceed to have sex, while Tyrion looks on, rather upset. So, what is there to say about Dany and Tyrion? Well, the major theme of the Dany and Tyrion story seems to be control. Dany begins her story wary of Varys' support of Viserys when Viserys was an idiot. I imagine she figured Viserys was going to be a puppet. And of course, Dany begins our story rather controlled by Tyrion. Dany and everyone else wants to attack King's Landing, but it's Tyrion's plan that goes forward. Olenna even gives Dany advice to break free of her advisors and be a dragon. And of course, Tyrion's control of Dany does seem to mirror that of Tywin's control over Aerys. But then things begin to change. Dany ignores Tyrion's advice and goes to war. She ignores Tyrion's advice and kills the Tarlys. And she ignores Tyrion's advice and goes to rescue Jon. And speaking of Jon, as time goes on, he is the one that becomes her go-to advisor. It all begins on the beach, but she eventually changes her battle plans for him. And the final display of Jon's influence is when Dany agrees to the boat trip when her other advisors have different ideas. Tyrion's fear of losing power is rather explicit as he laments the loss of control to Varys and broods outside Dany's bedroom when she's having sex with Jon. Now, Tyrion has been a rather noble character for the past few seasons, so it's interesting to see him hungry for power. I'm not sure if it's selfless, as in he really feels the world would prosper better under his rule, or if it's more self-serving, as in he's trying to recapture the feeling of empowerment he had when he was Hand to Joffrey. I do wonder if Tyrion, when discussing succession and democratic rule, was hoping that he could become the leader. Dany certainly accused him of that. I will say there are some intriguing ideas brought up in the Dany and Tyrion story, namely that Tyrion is actually trying to protect his family, whether consciously or subconsciously, and thus sabotaging Dany. I'm certainly curious about what Cersei and Tyrion talked about at the end of their discussion that turned her. Yes, it was a fake turn, but still I'd like to see how the conversation came around to that point. Granted, the show has fooled us before into thinking that there are interesting off-screen conversations, like with the High Sparrow, when there aren't. But I am optimistic that something of substance between Tyrion and Cersei happened. I don't think the story between Tyrion and Cersei is over yet. Now perhaps I'm projecting my hopes, but Winterfell is going to be hyper-crowded and King's Landing rather empty. I do wonder if someone from the Jon and Dany camp will be defecting to the Cersei camp. A Tyrion defection would be absolutely fascinating, though I'm certainly not holding my breath. Now, one large downside of the Dany and Tyrion story is the regression of the Dany character. She was boldly leading largely on her own from seasons 2 to 6, and all of a sudden she's more timid and deferring to Tyrion for guidance for some reason. At other times she's even being scolded like a child. It's odd to have Dany suddenly out of the driver's seat, and the whole conflict seems to be about whether Dany is going to be controlled by Tyrion or by her new boyfriend Jon, which is a bit demeaning for the character. Now Dany has always been a contradictory character, but this season it seemed to be a bit more on display. The show cannot really decide if they want to make Dany a noble revolutionary leader or crazy. Dany inspires Missandei and Jon, and Tyrion and Varys keep talking about her promise for some reason. Yet she also burns hundreds if not thousands without batting an eye, and threatens to burn her own advisors. People like Jaime and Tyrion are affected by the carnage, but Dany shrugs off the slaughter in a rather cavalier fashion. But overall, the Dany and Tyrion story was rather interesting, with quite a few scenes that allowed Peter Dinklage to shine as an actor. I especially enjoyed his scene with Cersei. Now yes, the military strategy and the teleporting didn't always make sense, but we did have that fun twist at Casterly Rock, and again I really like the idea of Tyrion subconsciously sabotaging Dany's plans the whole time. Tyrion actually still caring about his sister is an interesting enough idea that I'm willing to forgive a lot if that plot is in development. We shall see. And so those are all the storylines worth talking about. We can largely forget about Brienne, the Hound, and the Brotherhood Without Banners. Now, people love rankings, and they're always asking me where I'd put Season 7 in comparison to the other seasons, and I would say that Seasons 5, 6, and 7 are all pretty equal in quality, and to me, they're nowhere near as good as Seasons 1, 2, and 3. As for storylines this season, if I had to rank them, I would put Cersei and Jaime first, followed by Tyrion and Daenerys, followed by Jon and Davos, then comes Theon, then Bran, followed by Samwell, and coming in last is Arya and Sansa. And that's all for the Season 7 Watch Full Season Review. I do have one more Season 7 video that I'm going to make, and that's my Season 7 plot if I were running things. Look for that video in the future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.